Gonna be a this is gonna be a goddamn slow read today. I have a feeling, just a guess, but we're getting moving. See who ends up joining up and how slow this ends up going. We are making our way very slowly through 3.10, capitalist representation. There is a lot of stuff happening in this section as they really start bringing together everything previously that they've been going over and talking about the parts and the machines that are at work, how they operate, and where they come from and how they go. And we're starting to see a lot of the terms that they began using earlier on in the book. Holy shit, they use them everywhere. It's going to be dense. It is dense. There's kind of no way around that. So I had us, JK, I don't know if you have a different setup because I know you were here last week, so I'm going to rely on you. I had us at 248. What about where you had us, JK?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's where we are.
Okay. I have said us so many reasons. So, we want to go back to what do I want to do this week? I think we want to keep pushing forward because we're starting to make the distinction between codes, overcoding, and axiomatics. Now, when we talk about codes and coding inside of Anti-Oedipus, very specifically inside of ethnology, we're talking about sort of the rules of the thing or the meaning of the thing, how we come to determine that. When we talk about codes inside of they call it the primitive system, the Earth Socius. These codes are basically the rules by which social order is kept, how we manage these things. The despot comes along, overcodes those, places rules on top of those, meanings on top of those, denotes very particular things through writing and the new use of voice that sort of overcodes the original codes. Capital doesn't just simply come along and add new codes. The last two paragraphs, they were very much specifically going into why this doesn't happen, but they introduced the thing that does happen. So we have decoding taking place, followed by not a recoding, but by an axiomatizing. Now this setup that is happening, and as we're starting to move into it, is going to start bringing in a lot of shit from calc and mathematics, a lot of stuff from other places. This is what Deleuze loves to do. AO and ATP, 1000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus are rife with it, but bringing in a lot of things from multiple disciplines in order to sort of begin to make their point. And axiomatics is probably going to be one of the more complicated things. At the end of this, I'm going to toss in a handful of PDFs in the chat just to make sure that everyone gets a chance to sort of follow along and maybe have some, very dry reading as we get going. And it is going to be as it is, but we'll make our way through. Before I move forward, did anyone have any notes or things from last time around? Anything that sort of stuck with them as they made their way through? Anything that held over? Any comments or questions about sort of the reading to this point before I get into the complications we're about to experience? It's a lot. Excellent. So we'll move forward. Bottom of 248, I have the text shared. Please follow along. If you have questions, don't hesitate to pop them up and say so. I'm always happy to chat through everything that's going on and support where you need help. Feel free to jump into all of it. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. All right. So many reasons for defining capitalism by a social axiomatic that stands opposed to codes in every respect. First of all, money as a general equivalent represents an abstract quantity that is indifferent to the qualified nature of the flux. but the equivalence itself points to the position of a relation without limitation. In the formula MCM, money, commodity, money, commodity, money, the circulation of money as capital has therefore no limits. The studies of Bohannon concerning the tiv of the Niger. Oh, we did read this last week. We read this last week, didn't we, JK? I went over the tiv last week.
I don't remember. No, I don't think we read it last week.
Oh, we didn't go over the tiv last week. Jeez. I feel like we did.
Well, I think you mentioned it, but you talked about it a little bit, but
well, then we'll keep going and we'll find our way through.
Yeah, because I don't think we did dx dy.
Always fun. All right. Well, then I'll keep going. The studies of Bohannon concerning the tiv of the Niger River, or those of Salisbury concerning the Xian of New Guinea, have shown how the introduction of money as an equivalent, which makes it possible to begin and end with money, therefore never to end at all, is enough to disturb the circuits of qualified flux, to decompose the finite blocks of debt, and to destroy the very basis of codes. Secondly, the fact remains that money as an unlimited abstract quantity cannot be divorced from a becoming concrete, without which it would not become capital and would not appropriate production. We have seen that this becoming concrete appeared in the differential relation, but it must be borne in mind that the differential relation is not an indirect relation between qualified or coded flux. It is a direct relation between decoded flux, whose respective qualities have no existence prior to the differential relation itself. The quality of the flux results solely from their conjunction as decoded flux. Outside this conjunction, they would remain purely virtual. This conjunction is also the disjunction of the abstract quantity, through which it becomes something concrete. dx and dy are nothing independent of their relation, which determines the one as a pure quality of the flux of labor, the other as a pure quality of the flux of capital. The progression is therefore the opposite of that of a code. It expresses the capitalist transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. Whence the fundamental change in the order of powers, for if one of the flux finds itself subordinated and enslaved to the other, the reason is precisely that they are not to the same power, x and y squared, for example, that the relation is established between a power and a given magnitude. This is something that became evident as we pursued the analysis of capital and labor at the level of the differential relation between flux of financing, flux of means of payment, or income. Such an extension merely signifies that capital has no industrial essence functioning other than as merchant, financial, or commercial capital, where money would take on functions other than those deriving from its form as the equivalent. But in this way, the signs of power completely cease from being what they were from the viewpoint of a code. They become coefficients that are directly economic, instead of being doubles to the economic signs of desire and expressing, for their part, non-economic factors determined as dominant. That the flux of financing is raised to an entirely different power from the flux of means of payment signifies that the power has become directly economic. And yet, as regards paid labor, it is evident that there is no longer any need for a code in order to ensure surplus labor, when the labor is merged qualitatively and temporally with labor itself into one and the same simple magnitude, the condition characterized by surplus value, flux. A lot to go over in this. We're going to take it little bit, by chunk by chunk by chunk. With any luck, we'll be able to get through a good amount of it. And then we'll make our way through to the next little bit. So first up, let's talk about the sort of statement of the axiomatic as being the base of the way capitalism functions, that it functions by social axiomatic instead of code. They're going to define out a handful of reasons. I think we go through 2 here, and then the next paragraph is 3, and then there's 4th. So we've got a couple paragraphs to finish this off. The first 2 reasons are included here. The first example they're giving, and the first reason for it, is that money as general equivalent represents an abstract quantity that is indifferent to the qualified nature of the flux. The equivalence itself points to the position of a relation without limitation. It's hard to restate this in a way that is going to capture it, so I'm going to try to explain sort of around it and hope we come to it. The formula MCM versus CMC. This is classic Marx. If you haven't read Capital, I highly, highly recommend it. The core place for the formula CMC is the idea that you start with, people started with a commodity. I make a table, I make a meal, I make a desk, whatever it may be. I then exchange that for currency, for money, and then with that, I use it to buy another commodity. I sell my table for 5 gold doubloons. I use those 5 gold doubloons to buy a new ox for my farm. This exchange terminates. It opens with my labor and terminates with me purchasing someone else's. It doesn't continue. But the formula MCM, money, commodity, money, this is the shift we make within Capital. We now start with money first. It may sound like it's an odd sort of, and we'll say an annoying little switch where we're like, well, it's just, what's the point? But if I start with money and I buy an item and then I sell that item for whatever money, I end with money again, and the cycle necessarily has to continue. There is no end to this. You can't eat money. You can't do anything with money. Capital doesn't do anything, not really, not imminently, not the same way that commodities do. So if we have money, end with money, the circulation doesn't really have an end point. It doesn't have a termination. It doesn't have a limit. The example that they give of Tiv of the Niger River, which I went over last week and we'll revisit. The core idea of the Tiv is that the Tiv had a handful of really interesting sort of levels of their economy that they kept fairly separate. We can call sort of high-end luxuries. We can talk about sort of their middle tier, which I'll get to in a second, and then the lower tier, which we can say is subsistence goods. Subsistence goods is not going to be like a shock to you. It's food, water, bowls and plates and whatever else is shit you need. That middle tier, though, was really weird. The middle tier were these staves, these large staves that were made of a spindly odd wire. We would probably call them ceremonial. We would look at them as being ceremonial, and they kind of were. They'd be granted to people for activities. They could be traded for things, but you tended not to see them being traded for commodities because you couldn't break them apart. You couldn't, here's a fifth of a staff I'm going to use to shave off and give you for a little bit of food. Instead, they were collected in order to be spent on what you would call luxury goods or specialty things. The examples would be slaves and women were really the top two. Marriage, for example, or slaves, land, things like that. You could sort of expunge them and trade them in that way. This back and forth really always put them in this really odd interaction where they were bartering for the lower level stuff, storing these things for these sort of larger, sort of explosive moments of buying a slave, these larger luxury items. But it was really centered around this sort of odd interaction. Then cash showed up, and cash completely demolished the way that the Tiv worked. Instead of having these layers that were separated in these sort of specialty goods, it basically shifted everything to now, this staff is worth $25 and I'll give you $25 for it. Then you'll have money to buy commodities, but also you'll have $25. So if you want to buy another staff from another guy, you can go do that. And suddenly it created this quantification method for everything that was equivalent. It was a global equivalence across everything that happened. Instead of these qualified flux, as they refer to it here, where you have these odd stabs that are really not about the value in terms of their everyday or their gauche or their commodity items. They were for this. Now everything sort of got short-circuited that way. It destroyed the basis of coding inside of the way the TIV operated. There's a handful of really great books on it. I think I put one in the chat. This is one of the number one things they want to talk about, is that we can't call this stuff codes. We can't say it because it doesn't operate in the same way. This is destructive to codes. In fact, doesn't allow codes to exist at all, not in the way that we understand them. This is the first reason that they're talking about. They have to define capitalism through social axiomatics, opposing codes at every respect. This is the first one. Does that first one make sense to everyone who's in the hearing realm of my voice? Ideally Discord, but everywhere else too. Cool. That's the first. Codes go away at this point. Second, here we go. Hopefully everyone has a little bit more of a background in math than I do. This one is a bear for me. Going to continue to be a bear because the axiomatic as a thing is very complex, and I would even say people who have backgrounds in mathematics don't fully understand half the shit we're talking about here. So, you know, we're going to work it through together. Secondly, I'm just going to read a little bit and then we'll go through it. The fact remains that money as an unlimited abstract quantity cannot be divorced from a becoming concrete, without which it would not become capital and would not appropriate production. That's actually really the rest of this paragraph is summed up. They explain what they mean by it, but we can break it down pretty cleanly. The money as an unlimited abstract quantity, and it is an unlimited abstract quantity. There's no upper echelons in terms of like how much money there is. We don't really talk about it that way. There is this unlimited abstraction, and whether we have insane inflation where suddenly people have billions of dollars or their money is worth 2 cents, that these odd things that happen within the abstract quantification of money necessitates a becoming concrete. The becoming concrete is what things are worth at any given time. It needs to become something. It needs to become concrete. Without that, it can't appropriate production. It would stay the same as the stabs of the TIV, where it's more ceremonial, qualitative, playing inside of these things. If it doesn't have an abstract specific quantity that everything can attach to, again, it's a global relation, it wouldn't take on all of production. It didn't prior to capital. Money has been around in cultures for fucking thousands of years. This is not a new thing. Currency is a thing. Currency is not quite the same thing as money and is not the same thing as capital. Specifically, capital necessitates this universal sort of a value placed against it that happens when it becomes concrete. They then go through the way that we have seen that this becoming concrete appeared in the differential relation, but it must be borne in mind the differential relation is not an indirect relation between qualified or coded flux. It is a direct relation between decoded flux whose respective qualities have no existence prior to the differential relation itself. So the differential within calculus is about describing the moment that dx plus dy or dx and dy meet up, the crossover of these elements. But there is limits within this. This is like this is like base layer calculus shit. Calculus is about finding the limit of things, and it's about the curve and places on curves and places on plots and all that fun shit. What they're talking about here is that the differential relation is not an indirect relation between qualified or coded flux. This is not, oh, this sort of has this kind of qualified element, like, again, the TIV. I'm going to keep going back to the TIV stabs that have like, oh, this is a nice one. This is a pretty nice one. We don't give a shit about those things almost at all. It isn't these odd indirect, oh, we have these relationships. They're talking much, much more direct and much, much more hardened. It is a direct relation between decoded flux, whose respective qualities have no existence prior to the differential relation itself. There is no quality in this until that differential relation comes to be. And this is where we're going to start running into how we talk about stuff and how they're talking about stuff colloquially. It's going to start getting really tough. When we talk about quality versus quantity, the quality of things, I don't want to say immeasurable because that's not really the point, but it's an unquantifiable element. It is qualities of things. It is how do I want to put this? Does anyone have a way to put this? It's a really tough concept to sort of get across. I'm open, by the way, if anyone's got one, but it's a bear of a specific thing. A quality of a thing is essentially the thing that cannot be directly quantified. We have some level of that. The temperature, for example, is a famous one. Temperature is a quality of a thing. It's quantified. We have a way of measuring it, but it's not quantified in the way that other things might be. You can't cut, like if you can't cut it in half. We can have half the value of temperature, but that's not cutting it in half in the same way that if I cut, a loaf of bread in half, they're now exactly weigh half as much. I have half as much bread in each one. It's not really the same thing. The quality versus quantity is a really, really particular usage inside of this. When they talk about the quality of the flux results solely from their conjunction as decoded flux. Outside this conjunction, they would remain purely virtual. They would stay wholly within this sort of odd potentiality that is the virtual. Conjunction is the disjunction of the abstract quantity through which it becomes something concrete. The moment in capitalism that the fluxes of elements coincide, the dx over dy specifically, capital versus labor, where these things hit, the quality comes from this. It did not exist prior to this. This is the shift we start happening. It's no longer a coded element that has perhaps some qualities that may be contingent here or there. This is purely out of the derivative x and derivative y, because they cannot exist without this relation. Again, this is calculus shit sort of being brought in, but if you're talking about an equation, the equation and the resultant thing doesn't exist outside of that equation. Dx and dy are nothing independent of their relation, which determines the one as the pure quality of the flux of labor, the other as pure quality of the flux of capital. The progression is therefore the opposite that of a code. It expresses the capitalist transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. If we go all the way back to the surplus values of code, back to the earth and to that of the king or the despot, the surplus values of code that are produced sort of build up over time, and they build up in very particular ways. The examples that they use are like in great feasts, they need to be expelled. But surplus values of code is just cut off little bit by little bit when things interact. They get blocked by debt. There's a whole bunch of stuff. This is not that. This is formed in a completely different way. This is formed in the opposite way as that of a code. It expresses the capitalist transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. Whence the fundamental change in the order of powers, for if one of the flux finds itself subordinated and enslaved to the other, the reason is precisely that they are not the same power, that the relation is established between a power and a magnitude, something that became evidence they began going into it. Codes sort of interplay, but if there is excess code, it exists within that code and in part of that code. Some little bit gets sliced off. This is not how things work within capital. Everything gets broken down to these tiniest bits, as we were talking about earlier and have been for the last, 400,000 weeks, it feels like at this point, since we started 3.9. But as these bits are broken down to their smallest parts, as capital is using this, as these things start coming back through the flux of labor versus capital, just like it has since Marx began talking about it. These elements, we may notice that they have magnitudes of difference. Code doesn't do this. Code doesn't have magnitudes of quantifiable difference inside of them. Very different. This has that way. For example, the $5, the dollars that are being paid via, let's say, Tesla factories. I am just going to shit on Musk because it's easy. People get money at Tesla. They get capital. You get $80,000 for working on the assembly line, 110, 200,000 if you're a manager. Happy days. This is the flux of the D of X, the quality, the pure quality of the flux of labor. The other is the pure quality of the flux of capital. These things didn't have quality prior to existing, but out the other side we come with, here's the amount we pay workers, here's the amount that's paid to the board and to the owners. And it is orders of magnitude in difference. This is the shift between capital and conventional currency as well. The magnitude of it matters. It changes the relation in power between people. Someone in olden times, different type of power the king may have, but someone who has a bunch of money, Scrooge McDuck style, versus someone else, they may have some larger level of power when it comes to, oh, I can do X and Y, but you don't overrule the king. The king actually controls and runs, and there's odd interplays there. In capitalism, we do not have that issue. Someone who has that order of magnitude more money runs things. They have that power because this is what determines production. This is where production flows. This is how we have production get formed. And this is the line when they say, but in this way, the signs of power completely cease being what they were from the viewpoint of code. They become coefficients that are directly economic. Instead of being doubles to economic signs of desire and expressing for their part the non-economic factors determined as dominant, which you would have for wealthy priests or merchants or whatever it may be. Or, if we go back even further, the chief of a clan may have more of various codes or more elements. He will have some level of riches, sure, but those things are based in code. This is purely economic, and power being invested purely in the economic is very new and very unique to capital. It's in it, not around it, not coded, not a discussion. It's in the fucking thing. And this setup, this puts us in a very unique way that this operates overall. That the flux of financing is raised to an entirely different power from the flux as a means of payment signifies that the power has become directly economic. And yet, as regards paid labor, it is evident there is no longer any need for a code in order to ensure surplus labor, when the latter is merged qualitatively and temporally with labor itself into one and the same simple magnitude, the condition characterized by a surplus value of flux. This is playing through dx, dy, and all of these things coming together. Does this make sense? Hoping so. A lot. It is a lot. I'm not going to disagree that it's a lot. I am wholly aware that it's a fucking a lot. The axiomatic itself and how these things operate is incredibly difficult to sort of get into and to break down. It just is. And there's not going to be a part of me that says otherwise. Axiomatization is primarily something that you find within mathematics. And it is not a thing, we talk about, an axiom, a rule that we discuss, or you might say a syllogism or a saying, early to bed and early to rise, some shit like that. We're not talking about axiomatics in that sense. We're talking about something that exists prior to all that. The way that in the Earth Socius, the people who lived in that and were built and organized in that space, their desire was utilized almost immediately via the connective synthesis, and the codes of the world were determined. They were determined. You were born into a social space, saw the codes, had them inscribed into you had them carved into you, had them born into you in pretty horrifying ways. This setup is what made production happen as it did in that socius. The despot came along, took it over, took all those tribes under his wing, and became solely that thing that could overcode, could speak. And production became something that the king ordered. In China, they said, build this great wall. You can't tell a tribe to do this. You have to tell many tribes to do many parts of it. And this happened in England, this happened in Rome, this happened in the great Roman Empire. Hadrian's Wall is an example of this, all the way down to the pyramids of Egypt, all the way to whatever it may be. The despot organized. And that was done because the overcoding from the voice and writing, the way that the despot overruled and overwrote all the original codes, this changed how those people worked. Now, they had their connective synthesis followed by the disjunctive, which is the selection of either or. Their disjunction was trained, was built very particularly. It was built on the question of what does he mean? It mean, you might say. What does God want? What does the despot want? What does the king want? This wasn't something that was asked directly. This is what was answered when you made those decisions. You did what you understood to be the king's will and wish. This process of subjectivity in both of these is eclipsed by the third step, which is what capitalism brought to us, this conjunction of fluxes coming together, no longer overcoding. Now it shatters the codes, turns them into their tiniest pieces, mathematically tiniest pieces, abstracted elements. The way that the pixels on your screen are abstracted things. You may see my face, you may see someone else's text, you may, do I have reverb? Fuck, really? I would hope not. If I have reverb, someone else let me know. Oh, good. The abstraction for the smallest parts of things. This, they say, is the separation for capital. By shattering all of those codes and everything becoming their pure abstract bits, the way that the number 1 doesn't actually signify anything, it's a pure quantity. The way the number 10 doesn't, 1,000, 10,000. A dollar doesn't symbolize really anything. It's a dollar. It's an abstracted quantity with elements behind it. Everything is broken down now. No longer coded, no longer overcoded. It's all of these pieces. And all of these pieces, desire is interacting with as it goes. We still have this connective synthesis. Great. Things connect, partial objects, the smallest bits, the smallest abstracted bits connect. Then we have the disjunctive, either or, still that, what is meant? What does he mean? What is it? But then this third, which is the flux colliding with other flux, we have this last little thing, and out the other side, it's not that we are aware of any of this. Actually, this is making us, making the market, making meaning, making the subject. That last step is the axiomatization. It is the understanding of all of these things come together as their tiniest bits. No longer coded. Codes are particular. They are built and they are networked. All of these things. Capital shatters that, destroys that, and replaces it with the axioms. And axioms play with and give us rules at that base level that go inside of us, the same way that I was just talking about, that sort of insidious power structure of what does he mean by it? What is meant by it? Having to interpret and understand. Well, now that's baked in, and we're still moving past that to have the conjunction. These elements and these things, this is the challenge of capital. And they say that through this paragraph. These are the reasons. And there's 2 more we'll get to. But these are the reasons why we can't just talk about the codes today, because codes are irrelevant today. They're not part of the system. We still play with much of the same old baggage. It's not to say that stuff and that shit doesn't stick around, but we don't deal with them as codes. Instead, we deal with them as the result of dx dy as the result of the flux and the differential of elements. This surplus value still can be generated. All these things can still be done. Has nothing to do with codes. It's not surplus code, it's surplus flux. And this leads us to the next paragraph, but we'll take here. Go ahead, JK.
Yeah. So what is the common connection between codes and axiomatics? Is it are they still
There's
both
not.
Is it both still linked to power, or is it is the axiomatic more scientific or scientific based and it's mathematically based? Is that what gives it its power and acceptance?
There's a lot to answer in what you asked there, and I'm trying to figure out the easiest way to do it. Give me a second to see if I have a good line, because they don't really cover the axiomatic super deep by defining it here, and they only do it a little bit in Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus. And so they've instead it's something that got carried into seminars and other works and other things like that. So it's tough to really get at that. Specifically, though, codes within Capital are decoded. That is the first action of Capital. When it finds codes, it decodes them. It breaks them down to their smallest parts. And then what happens is an axiom is put in place. So the relationship between a code and an axiom is processual and temporal. They do not exist at the same time. They do not sort of work on each other. An axiom doesn't work on a code, and a code doesn't work on an axiom. Instead, it's the process of decoding and then axiomatizing elements and sort of the experience of people, the flux of desire, various machines, social machines, turning them into their little bits and then sending them back out again. And doing so with an axiomatic rather than with the coded set. Because a code can't be broken down into these elements. A code can't be made virtual. It can't be made qualitative. It doesn't allow for a dx dy interaction. They just don't. Instead, code itself, like the TIV, exists in very particular relations. And axiomatics don't really do that. Instead, it sort of layers in lots of very foundational rules that allow existence and meaning to be built in very particular ways, not necessarily in good ways or bad ways, just it operates very differently. Does that make sense? Okay.
But axiomatics is also a continuation of of a social power relationship, isn't it? From before, right? It's is it an extension of that power, the social power relationship, class society?
No, not necessarily. I would say not necessarily. The challenge with power and that previous element of the state, there's two ways it sort of sticks around. The axiomatization that happens within the state, and that setup, yes. There's another side to it as well, which is the axiom. How to put it? Yeah, this is a fun one. It has to do with the axiomatic, with the way that the coefficients and derivatives play with themselves. It's a question of like literal power, where I think a way to say it would be power within the despotic social societies is very focused on how the king exerts it. It's overt political force. Whereas within Capital, overt political force doesn't exist quite in the same way. Instead, it's very spread out, and it's much more about the quite literal powers. They use powers. I think there's a reason that they use that when they're talking about orders of magnitude. because we're talking about the correspondence of elements with other elements. To quote Blanche, who D and G are pulling a lot of this from, two sets are said to have the same power when one can establish between their elements a one-to-one correspondence, i.e. to any element of one corresponds one and only one element of the other, and reciprocally. That, for finite sets, having the same power is reduced to having the same number of elements. That, for infinite sets, the weakest power is that of the countable, the indefinite sequence of natural numbers. The power of the continuum, for example, on a line or etc., is greater than that of the countable. This becomes how they're talking about the denumerable or non-denumerable sets within this axiomatic that is capital. So when we have the constant capital that is being invested in things at levels of magnitude more than that is being given to labor, power is quite literally built in, I think is how I would phrase it. Does that make sense, JK? Anyone? You're free to tell me I'm being a shithead. I'm open to being made aware that I am a shithead. Do not worry about that. Yeah.
No, one of my questions was that is axiomatics and capital are more practically based and scientifically based, and it is a continuation extension of the economic system, right? The financial exchange, relationship between people in economics, financial, and so forth. So So is that more like practically based and scientific? And
Well, I think they're arguing that it's all of it at once. It's the reason they make the switch and they're bringing in so much together. The relations of people is one thing. The relationship of production is the big focus for them inside of Anti-Oedipus, and it's production at every level. They don't think that the desiring production is exempt from the rules that Marx talked about, and they don't think that there's massively different spaces for these things. The reality is production is being determined in particular ways. What is it we're manufacturing as a society? We're not sending people outside with buckets and tar to fix all the potholes. We're not paying people to do that. We're paying people to make TikTok videos and not paying well. What is it that we're organizing production for, and what is organizing production is kind of the big point. And they see this through, like Marx says, production is the big point. When we talk about primitive, we talk about the despotic, or we talk about capital. All three are organized particularly about how production is handled. And within capital, the axiomatic is what sort of handles the element that once was handled by codes, the rules of it all, or the ability for people to sort of generate and have that, the meaning or sense that is produced of these things. And this is where we start getting into sort of the larger bits of what these things are intended to be and how they work. They're very foundational rules at very base level. And these rules naturally build the rest of the society and the rest of the social thing around them. So again, Blanche is who they're using as sort of their setup as they sort of talk about it. So for him, he wants to, for Deleuze and for Guattari, they want to talk about what is this odd unity, this odd production setup. How does this work? It doesn't work with codes. Codes aren't a thing anymore, as they've just sort of finished talking through. And we've got two more reasons why, the two more reasons why. So we'll get to those too. But it's the setup is very particular here. Code doesn't work for two reasons. One is, as they say, the first is that money is an abstract quantity that is indifferent to the qualified nature of the flux. Money doesn't care about the qualified nature, the really the skill of the labor or any of those things. It's irrelevant. Labor is labor and doesn't really exist until after these things have come together. The skill of the labor has been shown to be produced. It's not prior to the dx dy interaction. It's only after, when value is applied and these other things. We don't have a independent relations of these elements like you would within the space of coded interactions, which is what's in the primitive and the despotic. Does that make sense? Because we got two more ways, and I think your question may work better in the next paragraph or after the next paragraph. I'm not sure which. We got two more characteristics of axiomatics to go through, though. We're not quite done.
I wanted to bring up something here regarding connective and disjunctive synthesis.
Please.
So, relative to how those terms are to be understood and how they function at a molecular level, at a level of the socius, or dimension of the socius, or from the perspective of the socius, they're taken as a different kind of a thing. They function differently, and so he refers to them as being taken as, with regard to the disjunctive synthesis, it's taken as being exclusive rather than inclusive, and the connective synthesis is taken as being, I forget, specific or. But so where I want to go with this is the question I want to ask is, or the issue I want to sort of investigate is, the distinction between those two ways in which these syntheses function, between the molecular and the social, can be, it seems to me that one way of looking at the distinction is it involves using a vocabulary of imposition or conditioning or what's a good word, introjection from social rules or axiomatics to I don't know how you would want to characterize this, but the desiring machines of what would otherwise be called, well, not individuals, but participants within that totality. That's one way of looking at it, which allows one to then talk about how, there is this almost a kind of a one-way shaping that takes place on the level of a society as a whole. So you could, if you wanted to put it into a vernacular, which would be a little bit near non-Deleuzian, the individual could say, "Oh, I've been brought up in this structure, the capitalist structure, or the despotic structure, and I had no choice in it," or that is to say, was the whatever this I, of course, that's where you would have to then break down the notion of the I itself, but. But the other way of looking at it is to say that the site of this influence or introjection or shaping cannot be from the social understood in terms of a group, because that's just as that itself is a problem, because that molar level of analysis, that level, that statistical level, the gregarious. Of gregariousness is itself a product of or the effect of something. It's the effect of the operation of desiring machines. But the site of that, I think, is neither social in the sense of a group that imposes itself on whatever an individual might be characterized at, or nor is it something which emanates from a classical notion of the subjectivity. It's something else. And that's important, because that something else requires us to talk about what, if that were the case, if we could understanding what Deleuze and Guattari's analysis here of capitalism, these other social features in that way, would require us to back away from I would say a more classically Marxist way of looking at how we are shaped by social structures. that takes us something a little bit closer. Well, yeah, it's yeah. For one thing, I think that it takes us closer to a relationship with Foucault and the idea of power is flowing through, and as power not being invested in either individuals or groups. They can't understand power in terms of groups or any of these structures that
Well,
impose themselves. They can't. Go ahead.
the family can.
The what?
The family.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. So okay. So if we look at it in those terms, in other words,
Oh, you're turned into a robot. Pull back, start over. You're turning into a robot. We're going to try one more time.
How am I now?
Much better.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. That's surprising. The city. So in the same way that the family is not an entity that can be understood from its own terms without seeing its origin within the structures, social structures. But the social itself, it seems to me we have to be careful not to reify either. In terms of which I think that Foucault was clearer about this than Deleuze is in terms of his separating his notion of how the power flows through social structures than Deleuze is, because Deleuze rarely says anything negative about Marx. He says negative things about Marxists, but not Marx themselves. And I think that can lead to a tendency to want to maybe to make use of a kind of a entity or a based origin of power, as if power it somehow becomes can be talked about in monolithic terms in relation not to individuals, but again to the effect that a group has on the elements of that group. I don't know if that makes any.
Well, so one of the challenges
sense
here is, I would say their core critique of this would be the way that, and it's why they have an entire chapter dedicated to capitalist representation. Representation under capitalism no longer, just to quote them, no longer relates to a distinct object, but to productive activity itself. The socius becomes directly economic as money capital. What is inscribed is no longer producers or non-producers as person objects, but forces, means of production as abstract quantities that become concrete in their becoming related or their conjunction. This position that social production takes on under all of this has one big, huge flaw, and this is, again, where a major distinction between Deleuze and Foucault, for sure. For Deleuze, this means that society actually doesn't tell us what things mean. Like it really doesn't. We don't have a social order where it says this is that, this object is this. We've broken away from that because we're at this point where the codes of old have been turned into the littlest bit parts. We've broken things down to these extreme levels. The job of the family, very particularly, is to give that subject formation a job. To quote Holland, for at the same time, the operations of social production and social reproduction via commercial trade alliances and financial debt filiations are completely taken over by capital as the new socius, human reproduction alone is for the first time completely segregated from social production and reproduction. Human reproduction, that is to say, is privatized in a nuclear family. The effects of such a segregation are decisive. For one thing, with social reproduction governed by the market, divorced from human reproduction, we're going to talk about incest, blah, blah, blah. The imperative no longer has anything to do with social ties or justifying or expressing glorious expenditure. It merely prohibits biological incest. That's it. In this respect, the nuclear incest taboo adds internalized, psychological forms of pacification to the political pacifications of despotism. But this capitalist form of pacification is more virulent because desire gets caught from the very start in a grotesque double bind. Isolation of the nuclear family from society at large segregates desire from all possible objects, except the ones that are prohibited, namely family members. Desire is forbidden access to precisely those objects that are, under the circumstances, most desirable. The nuclear family thus provides a perfect training ground for ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, ascetic subjectivity fostered and required by capitalist anti-production. What is more, the restricted and restrictive relations within the family do not just produce a generalized asceticism, they reproduce in microcosm precisely the basic relations of capital itself. For just as capital separates worker from means of life and defers gratification after work, after payday, after retirement, the father separates child from nurturing mother and defers gratification until maturity and the founding of his own family. So the structures of power that exist socially are not just one grand, huge power structure. This is very much, I would say that's like anti-deleuze. They don't want to talk about one grand power structure. It's not about that. To them, it's about the building of it, the process that builds these structures. And that's the deal. Capitalism is not just, oh, we have power in this very particular way. No, power is built into how meaning and life is derived from its start and how it is historically and socially determined as it grows and as it learns and then becomes that sort of the same way that a factory would be built in a particular way in a particular region by particular people, and that's very much socially determined. So too is the mini factory of the nuclear family producing subjects that are going out into the world with various neuroticisms, sure, but still very much ready for capital. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you pull back from a social formation, and then you look at how it's able to function through the way that the family then becomes understood as it does, or functions as it does.
It's tough because we have to remember there's no such thing as a social machine. That's not really, like, it isn't a stable entity. Social machines are simply desiring machines under determinate conditions. That sentence is probably one of the most important in Anti-Oedipus when you're talking about this, because it's not that there's some magnitude of transcendent structures. No, it's the same desiring machines that are investing immediately are investing everywhere. Now, this constant process of production, we end up with desiring machines in determinate positions. Those are social machines, but they're not divorced from desire. There is no separation in all of those things. It is entirely dedicated to desiring production and specifically specific way for desire to be produced. And with that comes subjectivity in a particular way. And with that, in mass, all the desiring machines interacting with each other creates a large-scale capitalist system. These are emergent, not determinate. Determinate location, position of desiring machines will be that social machine, but it's not a determinate social situation, not in the same way.
I agree with you that the term determinate conditions is key, and it's so difficult to kind of break that apart, because it can be done in a lot of
it absolutely
different
can.
ways.
Yes.
Yeah, because you've got the desiring machine and the determinate condition. Well, what is a condition? What is a condition, and the determination of it in relation to connective and disjunctive syntheses.
So when we have a social machine, take a social machine, a factory. A factory is a desiring machine under determinate conditions. This very particular usage they have, we can't talk about a desiring machine. That's not really how things work. They connect, disconnect, recording left behind. We're at the end of that process. Like we are the resultant recombination and disconnection and combination of a fuck ton of desire machines coalescing and coming together. And the third step, the conjunction of all of these, of the flux of these things, we consume, and then we fall back on it the same way that I say I feel hungry. That is a very simple version of it. I don't feel hungry. I don't know what that means, but I have fallen back on all of the meanings of what hunger could be because I've been taught that's what it's called. And I am hungry because it's my stomach, my body, my experience, everything. I fall back on all of that. Then suddenly out in the world, my desire machines don't give a fuck about that they've done this. It's not like I, as a subject, go out and start doing things separate from desire and production. Desire and production is doing its shit, and I claim myself in that entire process. And all of the other factories that you people are all doing the same thing. But there isn't like a single subject now that is going and out into the world and interacting, and I interact with you, and that makes a social machine. No. Our subjectivity is the falling back process. We are the sort of conjunctive mistake that's claiming for itself. But desiring production, all of the desiring machines that are disconnecting and connecting, they are still working. They still do their thing. And when we have a social machine that is this weird moment right now where we are talking, and the social machine of this Discord and YouTube and all these people, all the desire machines are firing off. This social machine is all of those desire machines under determinate conditions. The determinate conditions are the things we are talking about socially, but it's not us making them. We are produced by them.
I guess, how can a determinate condition be independent or external to the organization of, say, an assemblage?
Because it's concretized. It's made actual.
But the actual is not. Look at but in terms of the relation between the actual and, say, the intensities, out of which the actual is just a kind of a
Yes.
vapor. It seems to me that it's kind of like the relationship between, or if it's another kind of an axiom, say scientific axiomatic, that I mean, again, it's the later work of deleuze, but there, he talks about it. It's a profound slowing down of kind of what of the plane of consistency. It's a profound slowing down. It's as if it's almost an illusion that there is the determinate condition, if you will, of a scientific or an empirical axiomatic or mathematical axiomatic system. That it acts as though we take it as though it just is determinate in a way that sort of, that at least for a period of time, is unchanging, whereas in fact it isn't. It just appears to be that way. And the significance of putting it in those terms is that there still is point of view, perspective, and it's not the perspective of an individual, but it's not the perspective of a social totality either. It's the perspective of, say, a plane of consistency, which means that you can talk about participants within a social whole from that in that way,
Sure.
And then each participant is going to have a slightly different point of view on those determinate conditions. You cannot have I guess what I'm hoping is the case is that they're not understanding determinate conditions outside of point of view and outside of the fact that they're always going to, the same determinate condition is going to appear slightly differently for all of us who participate in it, because there you freed yourself from this connection to the traditional notion of subjectivity, because it's not I as a person. It's not my point of view as the point of view of a traditional notion of subjectivity, but neither is it point of view from the perspective of this sort of monolithic social whole. It's a point of view which protects us from falling into the trap of reifying both of those, either the notion of subjectivity or the opposite notion, which really is connected with it in some sense, right? Of a kind of a totalistic. So yeah, I mean,
Sure.
so,
No.
really
So
what-
it's
yeah,
spot on.
yeah, yeah.
Think of it as let's pull back and let's just talk about specifically social conditions and social production is a thing that exists as a historical contingency. Design and production are in it. We can say one and the same process. We could just say that, but specifically, to just quote Holland, in a critical sense, desire and production and social production are different inasmuch as schizoanalysis enables and expects us to judge any historical organization of social production according to the eminent criteria provided by desire and production itself, and thereby exposes, quote, the repression that the social machine exercises on desiring machines. Think of it in this way. And we can go like thought experiment wise. I love doing this stuff. Let's give it a shot. We have two things. There's just two molecules, two little circles. And at any given point, they're either not connected or connected. Happy day. The desiring machines are that. This is what they are. They're either connected or not. At any given time, at any given moment, they're connected or not. But they don't do anything beyond that. It's just these two partial objects connecting, disconnecting. That's it. Now, at large, when we have a bunch of these coming together, still true. Desire and production is the connection, disconnection, the process of that. But they start leaving behind things. There's a historical record. There's something bigger going on with these things. Now, is it actually being made? No, it's just the organization of them. It is just the assemblage. It is just the arrangement that seems to be leaving behind a ghost image of a Brooks or a people or a city that has no like direct imminent meaning itself, but it is the historical realities of these machines that now are in the position of having connected and disconnected a billion fucking times. And all of them have, like, there's these odd arrangements of things that have come out of all of this. Now, the historical realities of that are important, but they are not determinant. They don't determine desiring production. Desiring production determines them. They are the desiring machines under determinate conditions. This is what that means. So the awareness of the historicity, the social, the political, these things, sure, can exist. They exist in the social space as arrangements and diagrammatics and assemblages, whatever term you want to use. I've got a billion of them. So do D&G. But the desiring machines themselves, they don't give a fuck. They don't have a clue what a whole body is or an arrangement is. They don't know you from me, from anyone else. They know sensation, maybe, but they really know just connecting and disconnecting. And that little bit that's happening is the thing that's happening all the time. It's happening just ahead of where we are in existence right now. Desiring production is working and building and shit's connecting and disconnecting right ahead of us, right ahead of where your brain's at or anyone's brain's at. It's going. And as those disconnections and reconnections and all that shit's firing off, it's weaving the tapestry of desire that is going to cause you to be able to understand what I'm saying in some meaningful way, in the way that you've specifically done it. And you have a large organized sort of system called Josh, I'm going to assume because of your Discord name, and I have one called Brooks. We have these larger systems. Now, these are social machines. Brooks is that. I'm not a desiring machine. I'm a social machine, which is a desiring machine under determinate conditions, particularized here, socially, historically, and placed, determined right here. But I'm not the desiring machines. I'm the result. I'm processed. I'm the bread at the end of the line of the factory and the farmer. These things are the after images. And those after images take on some life of their own. They feel like it, at least. I've called myself Brooks quite often. You've called yourself Josh quite often. We call ourselves white, man, American, suburban, Denverite, Portlandian, anything else. These things sort of move on and they continue. And we have some reality to them because like the desiring machines experience this and we kind of repress them based on the same systems that produce them cleanly in theory in a vacuum in the first place, but over time bent backwards and pushed over all of these things and crushed and recrushed desiring production under representation and other systems that trapped desire, that trapped that natural form of progression and create the repression we exist within today. So these things, there is historical determinism that happens in here. There's historical realities in the social machines. Desiring machines are at the base of it. Does that make sense as a response, Josh? Sorry.
Yes, it does. I mean, I can, I think I do agree with that synopsis. I would just say that because it's the case that one cannot talk about, say, at the level of desire machines, that there's, they can connect or either not connect, but there's always connections and resonances. And that's not saying that they're always
We see them
in.
and we notice patterns, but desire machines don't really give a fuck in the same way. They're just connecting. The line to just steal.
Is that true? Is that true? Is an assemblage to say it doesn't give a fuck is to say it doesn't matter, which is to say that it's not. There's a level beneath that of a particular significant organization that's patterned. Is there ever such a thing as an assemblage which is not patterned? Does the pattern come at a higher level of analysis, or is that intrinsic to the very basic, fundamental, irreducible thing that we're talking about when we talk about desiring machines?
Well, then I would ask, the moment when we notice a pattern, what was it right before that?
Well, it was never the same pattern. I mean,
no.
I
mean, if we notice a pattern, we notice an assemblage.
Yeah.
It becomes a thing. The moment before that, it was that thing, like literally, like flash second before that, it was that thing that pattern was in theory still there. In fact, I can look back and go, see, look, the pattern was still there. But until then, was it a pattern? Was it a thing? Was it named? Was it a representation? Was it a whole body? Now, this is what they want us to begin talking about, because when we get into desiring production and we go back all the way back to the beginning of the book and we talk about partial objects and desiring machines and how they want to attach and what they want to attach to, again, there's two sides to desire that are really important for this. On the one side, we need to remember that desire has the ability, and they talk about this a lot, and I want to kind of mention why, but desire can obliterate a social form. It obliterates the social, like entirely. It can, because if it's not contained, if it's not placed inside of it, it just does its own thing. It doesn't give a fuck. There's a reason that they've attached schizophrenia as being the thing. Schizophrenia does not mean in this, I know I'm a fucking broken record. It doesn't mean like going schizo or being random and weird. They're talking about the autistic. They're talking about the catatonic. They're talking about people within institutions at large who wholly can't exist within our social space. This is what they mean by the schizophrenic. It is the non-normative, almost as a large class, not what we would call schizo. And so when you have this sort of this broken, demolished social order, which is the case for people who were in asylums that they were working with, people who have catatonia excessively, they don't have the ability to exist socially, but also as like an entire person or do things that keep themselves alive. It's kind of a horrifying thing. So that's one side. Desire doesn't give a shit. By the way, desire machines don't give a shit. The other half of it is that desire machines, they don't exist in a full vacuum. There is that little bit that's left behind. And they talk about this within the BWO, because desiring production gets organized like everything else. Children learn to shit when they need to in the toilet, eventually. I've got a 2-year-old right now, so it's a whole thing. But at some point, we all learn to shit in the toilet. I hope most of us have. Or to shit in a hole, or to not just shit in our pants as we're walking along. Now, how did we do this if desire doesn't give a fuck? It's because the process over time of how we've instilled rules, how representation works, and how desire becomes trapped in various ways doesn't have to be good or bad. It's not the point, but it does become trapped. It does become used. It does become taken up in a handful of ways that creates repression. Completely free desire would be pants-shitting catatonic in the corner. On the other side of things, you can have the neurotic who obsessively, just shits in little tiny plastic bags and wraps them up and puts, like, you can have a million angles of this, but the hyper control over it versus that, this is the repression that desiring production undergoes. This happens not just for shitting. This happens for how you go to work, how you respond to authority, how you decide who you're going to fuck, how you pursue somebody, how you find friends, how you decide what food you're going to eat today, whether or not you like listening to me rambling on at end, and whether or not Josh can handle dealing with me being a pedant about this, or whether I can deal with him asking these kinds of questions. All of this stems from desire and production at the base level. Capital uniquely doesn't do this via codes. It doesn't do this via teaching us, oh, here is what this means. Here is what this object is. We pretend it does. It doesn't do this. Conservatives really pretend it does. It fucking doesn't. Instead, meaning is sort of in this really weird hyper-distributed form. And Yelmslev and the way that they've been talking about it, the codes have been obliterated. No longer is someone a shoemaker. No longer does it even matter if that's your fucking name or what your dad did. All that's fucking gone. It doesn't matter what your dad did at all. It's like no one gives a shit. It doesn't matter really what you did last week. Who you are is changing. All these things are broken down to the point where the only thing that matters is this odd rate of change interaction with these handful of factors. And then in that, in order to keep that thing going and to keep that dx dy interaction alive, axiomatics are introduced. And axiomatics get introduced via the family. We're getting to this because we're finally actually at Oedipus. JK has been dying to get there ever since we started this fucking entire chapter with 3.1, because they're just like, we're not at Oedipus yet, not at Oedipus, because Oedipus has a lot of interactions. It is the very particular usage of how someone doesn't want to fuck their mom and the prohibition on that. It wasn't in the Earth Socius. The Earth Socius, you didn't fuck your family members, not because you had a rule about it, but because they were there for trade effectively. They were there to build alliances with others and other families and others in the tribe. You had to have that. And it wasn't even a thing you considered because you were out looking for other people, other tribes. You were in the social space in a large tribe dealing with all of them. The people you were around, you could desire. Your sister, no, I'm looking for new. I want new. I want someone interesting who's going to, be able to do something for my family. That's what you were pursuing. And it left a negative image of prohibition that we take today. We look back and we mistake that. But we have incest taking a second sort of play, because when we move into the despotic, everyone is basically related to the king, also their mother, also their, like, completely fucks up everything, because the king is everyone's daddy or mommy, the grand mum, king mum, the queen mum, as the fucking Britbongers sometimes used to say. This setup puts us in a really strange place because she's not our mom at all. Also, she can totally fuck anyone she wants. Every king or queen can. There's hilarious stories of this, but they have that rule. It's prima nocta. They can do anything. And other kings and queens from other countries, they're not my king or queen, but they were in that moment of marriage. They become my sister, but also my mother queen. And there's my king fucking my sister and my mom, which is weird. The way that the representations get twisted in the overcoding, how the king overwrites. In capital, all these get obliterated. So what do we do? Well, we have this underlying thing still. We have this prohibition against you can't fuck mom and dad. You can't fuck your kids. Why? Well, the reason is ultimately within capital because we need to teach repression. That's the thing we need to teach. You can't just go do these things. You can't just you can't shit where you eat. You can't do these things because desire needs to be controlled. Desire needs to be watched. And the family's job is to don't do this, do that. You're allowed this. You may have your own. Someday you get your own woman to fuck. Someday you get to have that thing. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy. Go do that. But not right now. Just the same way that they would say, hey, someday you get to be very rich. Someday you get to be very wealthy. And you get to enjoy all the fruits of your labor. Just not right now. Now go work for a paycheck. And it's not going to be very good. Also, life isn't going to be great. But it will get there. I promise. I promise it will end up getting there. Because this is the rules we're taught. This is the baseline of things and repression and organization we're taught within the nuclear family. The privatized separated, segregated nuclear family that is non-social, that forces kids to have all of the relations with mom or dad that they would have with an infinitely larger number of people. Maybe you have an uncle or aunt that's around, but that's not how it works anymore. Really, it's mom and dad, everything through them. And which one's the money earner? Maybe both now. It doesn't matter really anymore, does it? But all these parts are sort of broken and set in. And all of these things that capital's doing, all of this, these axiomatics are sort of placed within us, and it's a particular usage because these axiomatics play through the state. The state is where we stick around. The despot hangs out. He's the threat of death and everything is sort of in the marketplace now, that the king used to be able to just say, I'm going to murder all of you, or I don't like your village anymore, burn them all, and they would do it. That's not really the case anymore. Now it's capital. Capital, you don't work, you die. That's the way it works. That's welcome to, I mean, I'm in America, so it's 100% the way it works here. Other countries have softened that, but it's not wildly different. The family, their job is to basically be the state junior, to have the law and to teach that the law is a thing to follow, that you have to obey the law. You have to do the things that the law wants. You have to defer pleasure. You have to defer desire. You have to defer reward because it will pay off. Don't worry, it will happen. These things come down from axiomatics that the family as the private union and the state overruling runs. None of these are coded though. And that's this paragraph. It's this paragraph. None of these are coded. The whole setup puts us in a really fucking wild place. It is by one and the same movement, to just quote the book again, that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desiring production that represents the repressed as incestuous familial drives, which is not the fucking case. No, it's not baseline that we want to fuck our kids or fuck each other. It may seem like it's popular now on all those fucking porno sites that exist out there, but that's not the case. We've just had this image placed that this is why we need to control, because otherwise, dear Lord, could you imagine how awful it would be? It's not. That's not how any of this shit fucking works. But we have this image and it's put into us. Social production and desiring production operate like this. And this makes it seem like there is an autonomous Oedipus complex. Because we're about to get to Oedipus, so I'm just diving in, JK, for you. And to just quote again Holland, it makes it appear as if there were an autonomous psychic repression originating in the Oedipus complex, which would only afterward get extended to social repression in society at large. But here is where the political implications of Oedipal misrepresentations of desire become clear. For, quote, if psychic repression did bear on incestuous desires, it would gain a certain independence and primacy in relation to social repression. They go on to say, accepting this primacy would constitute a justification for psychic repression, a justification that makes psychic repression move into the foreground, no longer considering the problem of social repression anything more than secondary. And that's the final sort of terrifying thing that happens, because since all of this ultimately is about making this element at the base, you, the internal, putting it in your place, work on yourself, rebuild yourself, clean your room, we've forgotten that the social repression is where this originates. It doesn't start within you. Desire is a positive outward force, emergent, constantly wanting to connect, do new, find new, build new, connect. And then at the end, all of it is the social space, and the social impinges back in. And that repression we put second, because it works better for capitalism, to be frank. So when we say that the social space is desire and production under determinate conditions, we mean it in the space of the repressive capitalist regime, particularly. Sorry, Josh. I really hope you're still here and you didn't run the other direction.
No, I'm still here. No, I was telling that I was sort of, taking us a little bit on a tangent because I'm more interested in hearing, your analysis of the text. But
I hope I stayed in the realm, because it's a really interesting, what you're talking about is the shit where to me the rubber hits the road. What is the thing they're trying to get at here? How can we utilize this to adjudicate or to practically implicate the world in a way that we can change? And that's what the question you're asking is getting at ultimately.
Yeah. I don't know what you think of this, but would you had discussed in response to what we've been talking about just now, how it is that we end up desiring our own repression, basically, to put it simply, all the different ways in which that takes place, and all that is a function of how the desiring machines and their functioning at the molecular level is actualized in the socius. But would you not agree? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Within the social space, the socius is what organizes production overall. So it's a tough distinction. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm a pedant every week.
No, that's good.
I'm a pedant with this stuff because every time I know I have someone this is going to be the only time they listen to me is this one time, and I want to make sure I stick to it.
Yeah. No, I know the distinctions are important, but my memory for them, like memory of names, is hopeless. So it's good that I need to be continuously reminded of the importance of the distinction. But what I wanted to ask is, what do you think of the idea that at the molecular level that there is organization? For example, there's a diagrammatic organization of the plane of consistency. That's why it's called consistent, that it already has an organization. And that comes right down to, at the most irreducibly, if you want to call it the smallest level, that is, of just partial objects that either connect or don't connect. Whether they connect or they don't connect, they still are in relation to each other in series. So difference
but they're
is
not
relational.
But they're not.
Well, but difference is relational. If it weren't relational, if it didn't have addressed what surrounds it by differing, the difference is a specific way of addressing what surrounds it. So that's a relational difference rather than an arbitrary difference. If we started with arbitrary difference, then we build up an entire system, including our understanding of the socius, on the basis of arbitrariness. And I think that's that would be a mistake.
What I would say then is, and again, feel free to tell me if I'm misquoting or straw manning or whatever. My response very directly would be that when we talk about the organization of desiring production, we have to be very careful not to presume that they want to eliminate all repression. Not really what we're getting at here. When we talk about the way that desiring production is organized, we aren't really talking about a difference at the level of partial object. Partial objects and partial objects don't really get, again, I don't want to say they don't give a shit. They just don't. That's not how they work or sort of operate. They do their thing. Now, the thing is, they slough off little bits, and we move through the process of meaning generation. And if we want to go through logical sense, for example, the way that he does it there is not drastically different than how we're talking about it in this system. Bodies collide. The collision of bodies leaves behind a remnant of what sort of that thing was, whether it's a small emotive, affective thing, the experience. It sloughs off a little bit of stuff through the disconnection. This leaves behind, over time, a pattern. These little dots that are left behind is the body without organs. It is the surface on which consistency is built. This is not desiring production like at the bottom level. This is at the second stage of it. This is the disconnection and the recording. The recording of it is the image of, is the plane of consistency. So this is at that point. It's not down below that. So the connections, the disconnections happening, and over time we go, oh, this, my finger there, or whatever, like partial objects is kind of its own thing. But the larger image that is perceived at some point, we call it the pattern, but the day before it was that same thing. It's not like it changed drastically. That setup that's happening, this is where the plane of consistency begins to happen. And after that, we have subjectivity and these other things that are produced, blah, blah, blah. But desiring production begins before that.
doesn't he caution us against this before and after when it comes to these different,
Yes.
for example, the plane of consistency,
Yes.
Concepts and conceptual
Yes.
personae and the
Yes, but
itself,
he also would not want us to say that they're the same moment. Like it's cautioning against specifically the idea of cause and effect, because it isn't that these elements cause that and this is the effect, because the moment we do that, we divorce force from effect, which we can't do. Paralogism, baseline shit from Nietzsche even. But what we instead need to do is we need to realize that the immanence of these processes are against each other. There is no moment we can insert ourselves into these three. We are the production at the end of it. And we can be at some level aware, but there's no moment where we're able to, like, the way that we would at a factory go, oh, there's the conveyor belt, there's where this happened. That's not how it works. These things are immanent to each other, but there is an order. There is an order. Doesn't mean it happened before, but there's an order.
Yeah, and I suppose sort of supporting actually what you're saying. Deleuze actually, I think it was in the logic of sense, where he really says, even if you look at how connective synthesis, disjunctive and conjunctive, that disjunction is key to all of them in some sense. So thinking in those terms is that disjunction is a fundamental notion, even when you talk about resonances that allow for intensive the emergence of a self, or the byproduct that we call selves. So you can kind of so you can see what each of these forms of syntheses have in common really is different kinds of disjunctive relations, if you can if you want to put it in those terms. But
it's in line with the way Kant. There's a reason Deleuze talks about the three syntheses. This is like Kant had his syntheses of apperception that operated that really kind of did the same thing. It's not that it's one then another then another. It's not that it's three disparate things. It's the way the process works, and the process is immanent to itself. So we have part 1, 2, and 3, and there is no like interrupting or breaking it like this. You can't like insert. It's the process is these things, and it's happening constantly. And so these syntheses and this way of constituting experience, or the way experience is constituted, is desiring production. And this is one of the things that's really tough.
Yeah.
But specifically, difference comes about. And again, he talks about this. This is if we go back to DNR, but in this book, even he talks about how difference is found in the disjunctive syntheses of recording. This is where these things come to be. So to quote Holland, the aim of difference and repetition, Deleuze's major contribution to a materialist philosophy of post-structuralism, is to restore the concept of difference to its rightful place in relation to identity, extending lines of argument from Nietzsche and using them against most of the Western metaphysical tradition of Plato onwards. Deleuze insists that difference and multiplicity are the primary categories, that identity is secondary and dependent upon them rather than the other way around. Difference and multiplicity are what is given ontologically. They then get betrayed and distorted by operations, including the work of the negative from Hegel, that results in identity. Restoring the category of difference to its rightful place of primacy, in turn, transforms the concept of repetition, for it is henceforth necessary to understand repetition to not involve identity, or equivalence among terms, but difference and variation. This setup is specifically what takes place in the disjunctive syntheses of recording. The connective syntheses of production is the base level. This is, if we were to talk about drive, this is Freudian drive. This is that the first bit of desire. It is the charge of everything. It is the partial objects from Melanie Klein, whereas a thing connects with another, then another, then another, provided we understand the semantics of the term organ being used here to qualify these machines in the broadest possible polymorphous way as any partial object which gives or gets a charge or flow of energy through a connection. Connection, disjunction, recording, and then conjunction. And all of these things sort of culminate in those moments. Does that make sense, Josh?
Yes, it does. One of the most difficult aspects of his work is to um, is to try and see how one form of synthesis within at the molecular level implies and presupposes the other. I know you say you agree. Yes, of course he says it's not there's not a there's no before and after here, but of course, we have to understand the distinction between them, and that there is a kind of a construction. But I just don't think that if you will, the higher level of construction is possible without what makes notions of pattern and relationality and thematicity possible at that higher level isn't already present. You can't.
Oh no, it begins. It begins, like the thing begins with the first step of the three syntheses. It begins there. But is it present? I'm hesitant to say so, because the whole point of the three is that we don't, like, nothing comes about in that first. The second is bits of recording, and the third is the consumption of what is produced. So we have the intensities out the other side. We have lots of connections that are lots of recordings. Those recordings on the body of the organ create and interact and create intensities of various types and in lots of different ways. And think of it as these huge levels of intensities going up and down and varying and all that. And then there's you, the subject, as all of these intensities hit that moment where you're consuming them. You literally consume them by claiming them. I'm hot, I'm sweaty, I'm tired, I've been talking too long. I can't believe I'm still here talking to Josh's. I can't believe Josh is still here talking to like, these are the intensities passing through that I am ingesting and digesting. And those things begin with the connective syntheses, 100%, but they're not ending there too. Like, to say that the pattern is already there is probably accurate in one sense, in like the way that when a spider does its first strand of web, you can say that the web is already built. Sure, we can do that. Not right to say that either, right?
Yeah, my brain is about to explode here. I don't know if, I keep thinking of, the Heideggerian concept of care. Now, that is not Deleuze's concept. Deleuze had very specific, points of disagreement with Heidegger, but I don't think that they're so far apart that the notion of care, which is relevance, which is significance, which is irreducible in Heidegger, isn't there in a different way in Deleuze.
I'm not familiar enough to be able to say. I've tried Heidegger. Yeah. I've tried Heidegger, I think would be the end of that sentence, actually.
Well, all right. So what about Foucault? And Foucault, if you try and get to the bottom at the most micro level of relations of power, it's as if one piece completes the other. That is to say, in a relation and an understanding and a meaning and a bit of knowledge and a social practice. There aren't elements that simply can be understood or defined in terms of a difference that isn't a difference in relation.
Right here, I would just say, read Deleuze's very short, perfectly brilliant manuscript on Foucault. If you haven't read it recently, maybe go back to it. If you haven't read it at all, just go do it, because it's 100% what Deleuze focuses on. And it's where, in my mind, he starts making strides in terms of the diagrammatic, which is another concept he develops, and I think develops it much more strongly than a few other things. That is 100% what you're talking about. 100% entirely what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't read that. I've read.
It's like 90 pages or some dumb shit. It's like tiny, and 100% going to answer very clearly better than I can right here.
Yeah. You mean the book called, I think it's titled Foucault, and it was after Foucault's death. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, I haven't read that. Yeah, I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. The English translation is pretty good too. It's not perfect, but pretty good. Let me see if I can pull up a quote or two specifically on this. The French, it's called the New Archivist, because he's talking about making the move from the archive as an archaeology of knowledge. Boy, that's Foucault, to the new cartographer, the diagrammatic, the mapping through discipline and punish, and this is 100 years. God damn it! I'm gonna just link it in the chat too, that way people have it because it's just that good. All right. With that though, I'm gonna say, hey, we're gonna hold back for a moment. Say, one second. I need to get this uploaded. God. There's fucking Discord. There you go. Sorry, I have too many windows open. Hope this is a good PDF of it. I have like 9. This is the library one too. Both are recommended. Both are spectacular. It's beautiful, but it is about this. It's about the dynamics, and it's I mean it's really great. It's really great. With that, that was a long road. We're gonna move to the next paragraph in a minute, but first I'm gonna leave it open, see if anyone has a question. Keltos. What was the passage you quoted from a while back? Nuclear family. I remember how the word ascetic. Yes. 2 seconds. That's from 99% certain. That was when I was reading from Holland. Eugene Holland's book on Anti-Oedipus is, to me, the best secondary text ever written for it. So I always recommend it. The work that they end up doing inside of it, the work he does in it, is fantastic. And it's very particular about how he uses various terms. Second. That's what this is from. That was that. I mean, there's like 90 quotes of asceticism. They'll be getting into that too, because it's actually from this chapter, and then it's from the next 2 sections of this chapter as well. Because the move of capital within the nuclear family and with desire is asceticism. The idea of the priest, again, is straight in line with Nietzsche as a thing. Deleuze wants us to understand desire at the baseline, that there isn't a natural negative, that there isn't a will naturally within us to do these things that we don't want to be doing, that instead it's quite the opposite. Highly, highly recommended. And because we have enough new people in there, give me a second. We'll go Holland. Damn it. Eugene. That in. And we also have, if you are on a server, head to text requests. Penned there is the DGQC library. Find a whole bunch of good stuff to read anytime you need it. But with that, any questions or notes on this? And I'm going to move to this new paragraph, which I think we can finish today, I think. This paragraph, not the section, but I think we can do this paragraph today. Yeah, because it's the first, the second. We're figuring with the advent of capitalism full body. And the fourth, yeah. All right. That's what we're going to do. That'll be nice. All right, so we'll move forward, bottom right of 249, and we'll keep going. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to type them out. I'll get to them as I. Hence, capital differentiates itself from any other socius or full body, inasmuch as capital itself figures as a directly economic instance, and falls back on production without interposing extra economic factors that would be inscribed in the form of code. With the advent of capitalism, the full body becomes truly naked, as does the worker himself who is attached to this full body. In this sense, the anti-production apparatuses ceases to be transcendent, pervades all production, becomes coextensive with it. Thirdly, as a result of these developed conditions involving the destruction of all codes within a becoming concrete, the absence of limits takes on new meaning. This absence no longer simply designates the unlimited abstract quantity, but the effective absence of any limit or end for the differential relation where the abstract becomes something concrete. Concerning capitalism, we maintain that it both does and does not have an exterior limit. It has an exterior limit that is schizophrenia, that is, the absolute decoding of flux, but it functions only by pushing back and exercising this limit. It also has, yet does not have, interior limits. It has interior limits under the specific conditions of capitalist production and circulation, that is, in capital itself, but it functions only by reproducing and widening these limits on an always vaster scale. The strength of capitalism indeed resides in the fact that its axiomatic is never saturated, that it is always capable of adding a new axiom to the previous ones. Capitalism defines a field of immanence and never ceases to fully occupy this field. But this deterritorialized field finds itself determined by an axiomatic, in contrast to the territorial field determined by primitive codes. Differential relations of such a nature as to be filled by the surplus value and absence of exterior limits, that it is filled by the widening of internal limits and the effusion of anti-production within production so as to be filled by the absorption of surplus value. These constitute the three aspects of capitalism's immanent axiomatic, and monetarization everywhere comes to fill the abyss of capitalist immanence, introducing there, as Schmidt says, quote, a deformation, a convulsion, an explosion, in a word, a movement of extreme violence. So this third thing is talking about sort of, again, the nature of how these sort of codes would operate or did operate, and how as these, as they say, capital differentiates itself from other socio-civil body, as capital itself figures as directly economic instances, falling back on production without interposing extra economic factors that would be inscribed in the form of a code. If we go back to the gift, which you can read a bunch of different fantastic historical works on the gift, but if you give a gift or buy something from someone under a king, under a despotic king, or under the earth socius, it's not just a simple transaction and it's over. It's not how it works. Instead, there's extra things added in the coding of what that transaction meant. You bought from this family, they gave you a good deal, therefore you owe that family as you go to the next thing if they ever need to buy from you. And they owe you in this particular way. You have a gift, you give a gift. We still have this sort of etiquette, in Midwest US etiquette. It's overseas quite often. You run into it a lot when a gift is given. It's, oh, I owe a gift when I return. There's these layers to these things that are always added in, and extra bits that are inscribed in the form of code. The advent of capitalism, this full body becomes naked, the worker himself attached to it. In this sense, anti-production apparatus ceases to be transcendent. Anti-production being these extra little bits of repression, storytelling, king on high, whatever it is, repressive debt-based elements, this anti-production that blocks or stymies desire, no longer transcendent. It pervades production itself, becoming coextensive with it. And this is the third reason that we have to use axiomatics instead of codes in order to discuss how capitalism functions. As a result of these developed conditions involving the destruction of all codes within a becoming concrete, the becoming concrete of the dx over dy, the absence of limits takes on new meaning. because there is an absence of limits. It doesn't have the anti-production working. It's no longer this overall thing. Oh, you can only rise so high, you can only do so much. There's a feeling that there is no edge, that there is no upper limit. We don't really have, like, that doesn't exist for us anymore. It's a new meaning, though. Its absence no longer designates this unlimited abstract quantity. That's not it. It's not that there's infinite money out there. That's not really how it sort of comes to be. It's instead the effective absence of any limit or end for the differential relation, where the abstract becomes something concrete. That differential relation, the way that currency and paying the constant currency and labor cost, there's no end to that relation. It can go as far and horrific as it wants. There's no end to that. Concerning capitalism, it both does and does not have an exterior limit. It has an exterior limit that is schizophrenia. This would be an absolute decoding of the flux. As I was just talking about with Josh's, the absolute decoding of flux, where these things sort of collapse down on themselves, and there's no meaning, nothing, just desire flowing out. Yeah, capitalism doesn't exist there anymore, like at all, but neither does society. So there's an absolute limit. That would be it. You can't have capital show up there. It doesn't give a shit. There's nothing being produced, no meaning, no instantiation, nothing. It's just out it goes. That's one. But it functions only by pushing back and exercising this limit. Capital has to constantly keep this at bay. It does this in a lot of different ways we'll get into later. But this is basically, they're starting to talk about the need we have as a society for limits. Codes don't have this. Codes have limits built into them, and they are at large and transcendent and built into larger social structures. Not really how it works for us, not under capital. Even though it may feel we're deeply repressed, we are, but it works not in the same way. It's not in any transaction as a thing. It's instead really baked in, deeply in sort of the bits and bobs that capital's working in those abstracts becoming concrete. And this other thing that happens that capitalism has, and they talk about it in terms of the interior limits. It has interior limits under specific conditions of capitalist production and circulation in capital itself, but it functions only by reproducing and widening these limits on a always vaster scale. So think of, here's how large and how good life can be for everybody. Here's how much you're allowed to do. And then there's this sort of internal limit. They talked about this just a bit ago, just to sort of revisit how capital functions. Hey, we've got a factory. Cool. Everyone's got the same factory. Hey, Steve made a way to make the gadget 5% more efficient. Oh, fuck. That's great. We got 5% profit. Yay, we made 5% profit. That limit of what capital can do got extended and then pulled back, because that 5% doesn't just go to everyone being able to spend and do things. No, it has to be saved, because we have to reinvest in everything else in order to be ready for the next time that capital does this. There's always a need to defer the realization of that sort of thing. This push and pull that capitalism has. Capitalism defines a field of immanence and never ceases to fully occupy it. But this deterritorialist field finds itself determined by an axiomatic. Differential relations of such a nature as to be filled by surplus value and absence of exterior limit filled by widening internal, and the effusion of anti-production within all of it. These are three aspects of this immanent axiomatic, the way that not codes, but axioms pervade the system. This setup puts us in a very different place than codes would be. Monetarization everywhere fills the abyss of this capitalist immanence. This is the third step of the thing. That makes sense as I say it to everyone who's here as the third step of the third reason that we need to be talking about axiomatics and not code when we talk about capital. Everyone following? The question on YouTube, it's not, there's no puerile questions. I appreciate all questions. If the socialist is capitalism, then are all instances of the socialists, while capitalism bad, or can production of good immanence occur within capitalism? So first, there is no sort of parts of the world that are not within capital. They're all, that capital is a global market necessitated by the way it operates. We all utilize the dollar. The reason for that is there needs to be this very particular way to abstract all value and everything against each other. We need to be able to break codes down fully, abstract them against that value. We may let people have some sort of antiquarian ways of doing things in local order, but short of being an entirely uncontacted tribe, you don't exist outside of capital. Everyone does. So within this, is everything bad or good? Not quite the question to be asking. Everything is repressed. Doesn't mean good or bad necessarily. There's repression that happens under capital that's producing you that is good and bad. There's a lot of things happening in a lot of different ways. And it's much less about saying, oh, here is a version of production that works in capital, and here's another one that maybe produces less. No, it's all across the board. It's all repressive in this very particular way. It all utilizes representation in this particular way. It all creates subjectivity in this particular way. And we exist at the end of that process. So instead of the question of, is there instances within capital that can be good or bad? It's capital is producing what it's producing, and it reproduces itself through us, and we reproduce capital in our activities. Always, always, always. It's instead about understanding these processes, how we can tweak them, what we can do, and how things can be changed within them. As I like to ask, there was no one who set out to make an end to monarchism and despotism. It happened through a lot of contingent, odd interactions over time. And these are the kind of interactions we're looking for. If we want to bring it into capital, which I do, there's good stuff too. I don't want to go back to, I'm not some weird anarcho-communist wanting caveman life, and I'm really not a monarchist. I think there's things we can move to forward. That would be the goal. Open to questions, though. Any others? Because we are nearing the 2-hour mark, and I may hold here. And next week, we'll probably get to the 4th characteristic for the axiomatic. And we'll spend a little bit of time going over with that the axiomatic as a concept itself. I've been working on a way to be able to talk through this. It was a little more awkward this week than I wanted. It will be awkward because it's a fucking weird one. But I'll post a handful of texts and then mid this week, be watching for my soldering stream because I'm starting that again. And we'll be going over anything you may have questions on with the whole thing. So with that, though, I'm going to probably check out. I've got videos to edit. We have 3 or 4 more readings that are now going up on the YouTube channel. So poke around, be watching for our empiricism subjectivity reading, Merleau-Ponty, and lots more. So thank all of you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.